Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me on the jungle. You're listening to or watching Stripes with Slike. We're talking about becoming your best creative self with Haylee Kalani of Kalani Consulting. Haylee, sorry. Thank you for being.
Thank you for having me. I'm stoked. This is so exciting. I love doing live stuff. I don't get to do them often, so it's like an extra rush of exhilaration. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the thing is, I rarely do any podcasts that aren't live. So this is just normal for me.
Nice. Yeah, you
Yeah.
must be like just pro by now. It's just, it probably feels the same. Maybe it feels weird not being live.
I kind of feel like there's pretty much very little professional about this podcast. We talk about professional things, we have professional people working behind the scenes. I just like to talk to people.
I feel the same too. I feel like that's what podcasts are all about. Even if
Yeah.
nobody's listening, the bare minimum is conversation.
It's like being on the air at my college radio station. We knew nobody was listening, but we were still having a good time.
Yeah. Who cares about anything else?
Yeah. Well, this podcast is all about creativity, and you actually come at it from a very interesting viewpoint. You're about helping people be more creative. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's more of a creative transformation, so to speak. I am a firm believer that if we are more creative in our personal and professional lives, then everything flows just a little bit easier. It becomes easier to solve problems. It becomes easier to create fun content. Becomes easier to build relationships that can flourish and create better opportunities.
That's awesome. Now, what I like to talk about in my podcast is I like to get your background because everybody's got something that started them down their path and affected them in such a way that they ended up where they are. So, could you give us a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. We'll connect the dots going like all the way back. um,
Through line.
yeah, it is. It's more like this when you really look at it from a bird's eye view, but it's in the moment it felt like how is any of these experiences or moments in my life actually going to connect to something in the future. But ever since I was a kid, I've always been really creative. I loved living in my own world, in my own head. I was very introverted, I was very introspective as well. And as I was growing up, doing normal kid stuff, my life, I mean, it sounds dramatic, but it sort of came to a halt because at one point I was diagnosed with aplastic anemia, which is an autoimmune disease where your good cells are attacking your good cells. So for me, it was like the whole world was my global pandemic, for lack of a better word. And so I was in and out of the hospital for a few years and went through some surgeries and things. And I was put into remission a few years later. So I'm all good now. But during that point in my life, I had a lot of time to sit and do not a lot of things. And my mom would bring me little crafts and things to do and be creative. But for the most part, it was just me sitting, thinking. And I love to think in the future. I love to be in, um, you know, uh, daydreaming worlds, so to speak. And after I was able to do that, I had doctors and nurses who essentially saved my life. They were using their skills, their expertise, and they were all so nice. Like I don't remember a single nurse or a single surgeon or doctor being like a little, what's the word? Just like a little off, like a little rude, a little harsh. But it makes sense because they were all in the children's ward, and so it was very, even though it was an uncomfortable time, it was a more comforting experience. And I looked up to a lot of those doctors and nurses, and I was like, wow, they're doing a lot to help people with the unique gifts that they have. And I didn't really think about it that way in my 8-year-old brain. But as I got older, I continued following my creative heart and passions, and I was always into music as well. And so played in like a couple of cover bands. I don't know if you know what the School of Rock is. Not the movie. There's like an actual School of Rock.
Yes, yes.
So
Is that in Atlanta?
I think there's a couple of them now. The one I went to was in Seattle, but I do
Okay.
believe there might be one in Atlanta, maybe
Yeah.
California as well. But it was a
There's
really
one in
awesome experience.
Atlanta. There's one in San Diego, which my friend is a part of. Like he was an instructor there. Yeah, it's. Oh, I saw a School of Rock band play in downtown Duluth at the Square. Pre-pandemic, and the kids were great. Like you
I
wouldn't
know.
like if you just closed your eyes and didn't see that those were kids on stage. Like you'd think it was adults.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it was
Yeah.
fantastic.
They were so good, and I had such an awesome experience doing that, and so it fueled my love for music even more. And as I got a little bit older, so that was maybe like middle school, early high school age, as I got older, I got my first job, and I wanted to shift where I was in the music industry, so to speak, at that time. And I went from being on stage to wanting to be behind the scenes. And I was like, how do I want to be part of the creation process of where does this music even come from in the first place? Somebody has to make it, somebody has to record it, somebody has to mix it, and then somebody has to, mix it live on stage to make sure everything sounds good. And that really interested me. And so got my first job, bought all my own recording equipment, had no idea what I was doing, and just started playing around with it. And I had loved it so much. And at that point, I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And so I dove into it. And I told my parents, I was like, this is what I want to do. This was at the point in high school where you're trying to figure out what you're going to do after high school. Go to college, get a degree of some kind. And so I was looking at music colleges and everything, and nothing really seemed to fit the bill. And I found this recording studio in Seattle, Washington called Robert Lang Studios. And they have a recording studio program outside of their own studio. And so they teach you everything that you need to know about audio engineering and mixing and mastering and all of the incredible things. And so I begged my parents. They made it happen. Don't know how. We weren't super wealthy, but they made it happen for me. And I was like, yes. So went through that program, graduated. They eventually hired me on as an audio engineer. I was stoked. I was living life, but I wasn't really paying the bills with that. I was, there for some projects, but more so as an intern, or, I was there, but it wasn't enough to move out, have my own place, also afford groceries, also afford all the other things that now my adult world has brought in. And I had met so many incredible people along the way in the studio, and they were so talented. They were so talented, but along with myself, they couldn't make a dime off of their music. And it frustrated me. It frustrated me to see other people struggling to do the same thing. And I thought, God, if you could just, you know, put yourself in front of the right eyes and ears, people would fall in love with your music. There's no reason why they wouldn't. And so that landed me into the sort of content creation, social media space. And I met a mentor of mine. She was in the entertainment industry. She had her own entertainment company and was a music lawyer. And her son was also part of a rising Seattle band at the time, still now, really. And she taught me everything I needed to know about like the business side of things, and was like, hey, you can monetize what you're doing. You have skills, you can learn and get certifications and just test things. And so that's what I did. And it snowballed into me working with who I knew at the time, which was musicians. And so I was helping bands and musicians and audio engineers and a couple recording studios with their social media. And at that time, it was more of like the management style of things. And so I would post for them, I would create the images, but it wasn't the idea portion. And I was still craving that and chasing that. And so after a lot of trial and error, lots of months, lots of spinning my wheels, I shifted into the coaching space of how do I help somebody become the most creative version of themselves, the most productive and connected version of themselves, so that when they go to create content, when they go to network with people, they can do it in a way that is really attracting, again, the right eyes and ears. And that relationship can be seamless. And so that's what snowballed into what I do now, which is that high performance creative coaching.
Well, that's really interesting because when you're producing music, you're often bringing out the best of what somebody's doing, and and so you're kind of tweaking it and making it like doing the different levels, and it seems like that's just such a natural fit to go from producing to coaching. And I never thought of it that way. That's very cool.
Yeah, now that you said it, I don't think I've ever thought about it like that either. But now that you do say it, that was my absolute favorite part of producing for people was the subtle tweaks of how can I make you sound just a little bit better when you already naturally have it inside of you. And that's the cool thing too, is we all naturally have this thriving, creative, abundant side of us. And I believe that over time, it just kind of atrophies like a muscle because society or school or jobs and all of this stuff suppress it. It's like, do what you're told, execute on the thing that you were given, and that's it. And we don't get a lot of time to really stretch or massage or make that creative muscle stronger. And so that's like you said, sort of the same thing with producing and audio engineering is how do we make you just a little bit stronger in the areas that you already have talent in.
Mhm. Well, Picasso said every child is an artist. The trick is how to remain one as you grow up, as you become an adult. And it seems like that you're still an artist. You're just doing it in a different way. And I saw that a lot of the people that on your website who have been like singing your praises, all your testimonials, things like that, are a lot of self-help people. So it's almost like you've created this feedback loop of positivity where you're helping people help other people. You're helping people who help other people.
Mhm.
Can you give us an example of how you've helped some of your clients like break through some creative obstacles?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, so I'll give you a specific example. His name is Jeff Harry, and he is the founder of Rediscover Your Play, which is very closely in line with what I do, but he specifically helps companies, businesses, or executives have better relationships, be more productive, but through the act of play. And he specifically wanted an angle more so to help him. How do I create an online presence that really embodies me, but is attracting the right people? Because you might be like, oh, if I'm just posting about play and fun stuff and funny TikToks, are executives really going to see me or find me? And so that was a tricky balance that we were going to work through together. And so we I think you've actually mentioned this. I was doing some little research before I hopped on here as well. You were on a podcast and you were saying that creativity is not necessarily like an act or like drawing or painting, right? Like we might think. It's just a different way of thinking. And so,
Exactly. A
yeah. And
different
so,
way of doing things. Yeah.
yeah. And so we approached his just a different way of thinking for his social media. Instead of thinking, oh, LinkedIn has to be X platform for, you know, executives only, where we post this type of content only. Let's shift it a little bit. Who's really a part of this? How do we tap into their inner child, but without overwhelming them too much? Or let's say Instagram and TikTok. He loves making TikToks. He's super funny, and those might not translate to the LinkedIn world. So we said, okay, well, how do we make funny skits essentially more relatable to that type of audience? And I was just thinking about it from those angles. And one day, full credit to him, he came up with this idea all on his own. He did something about LinkedIn messages where you get like those spammy messages on LinkedIn, and it's people creeping in your DMs being like, hey, you want to buy
Hmm.
this? Or maybe it's a little secretive at first, and then the fourth message in, it's like, you want to buy this? So he made a video like that, and it took off. It took off, and it was just the subtle tweaks of like, all right, let's connect it into this platform in a way that that audience can really resonate with it. And so that's an example of how just thinking just a little bit differently and looking at it from maybe a bird's eye view or an objective perspective can help us create more momentum.
That's fantastic. Um, now, so you grew up in Seattle, which is just a beautiful, creative city. I'm in love with Seattle. I went to Bumbershoot, I think, 8 years in a row. Um,
That's awesome.
so tell me about how being in that city, like the home of Jimi Hendrix and Nirvana, and how all that creativity had an effect on you growing up.
Man, it's hard to explain because I think it had such a big effect, and because it was such a big part of my daily life that I didn't really ever think about it, or I didn't think like, oh, I'm so lucky to be in this space where all of this creativity is readily available and the people who are creating are readily available for me to talk to. And I think the starting point was really getting into the communities of creativity. And it started with that recording studio. And that recording studio was responsible for recording Nirvana and the Foo Fighters and Soundgarden and Macklemore, and just like it blew my mind. I was so grateful to be there. And that's when that idea of, oh, your network is your net worth sort of thing really hit me. I was like, oh, if I can really get involved in these communities here, that will allow me to make better connections that will be fruitful in maybe the short term, maybe the long term, maybe never, but I'm going to have fun trying it along the way. And so it started out in the recording studio, but that led me to there were cafes that did, slam poetry on the weekends. There's a KEXP radio that does like lessons for musicians or songwriting or lots of other things. And so I would go to those. And festivals, they like fuel my fire. And every time I would get excited or flooded with just that rush of dopamine from music, from, the art in the middle of the street, or you go to like Gasworks in a park, which is, I mean, for anybody listening, maybe Google it. It's a beautiful park,
Yeah.
and there's like all these structures around. Being around that, I think, just helped that excitement bubble. And because of that, my creativity was able to continue to flourish. Like I had things that fueled the inside of me so that I could express it outwardly later.
It's very interesting. And so the inside of you is just like bursts forth in an outward expression, kind of like how you present yourself. I mean, you've got interesting piercings and tattoos and things like that. So it's like you just can't contain it. And who would
Yeah,
want to, right?
exactly.
Um, so when you're not in Seattle, you're you're passionate about travel, aren't you?
Hmm. Hmm.
Same. Like, so how do you use travel? Does it refuel your creativity? Do you go out and look for things, or is it taking a break from?
A little bit of both, and for me, they're almost like one and the same. Like going and exploring is, in my mind, sort of taking a break from everything else. And so for traveling, I've actually only been outside of the country once, well, twice if you count Canada, but it was so close that I don't know. Feels like the US, just with different accents, maybe. So I went to the Philippines, and that was incredible. And that was more of like a break. We went with, pre-COVID, we went with a group. We got to do incredible experiences, but everything was taken care of for us. So I was just, brain dead, didn't need to think about anything, was just along for the ride and had a great time. So that was
Was
more.
it like a Kentucky tour or something?
Yeah, it was called One Life. Awesome company, by the way, if anybody wants to look it up. But it was like a group of, I believe we had a large group, it was like 15, almost 20 people. And we did stuff like zip lining, and we swam with whale sharks, and we had just all the
Well,
things.
you are You're telling me you actually swam with whale sharks?
I did. I did. It was probably the most incredible experience in nature I think I've ever had.
That's amazing because we here in Atlanta we have the only whale sharks in captivity in the world, but seeing them out in the wild, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was.
Okay, I've been on whale watching expeditions and we've never seen a whale. So you had to go and find them and then go swim with them.
Yeah, yeah. It was really, really awesome. And things like that, they just fuel me, and it allows for that really it's like a connectedness and a solitude in some way in nature. I found that those two things for me personally really spark that creativity. And so when I apply those things to travel, maybe not in the US, or excuse me, not outside of the US, but even in the town that I live in, like going to a new place, it really sparks a lot of that inner creativity.
That's wonderful. We're having a question come in from Vanessa Martinez. Uh, what is your go-to advice for listeners that are struggling with creativity?
Mhm. I am going to pull directly from something that works personally for me, but I actually the more so concrete idea came from Jeff Harry, the gentleman I was talking about earlier, founder of Rediscover Your Play, is getting bored. And the idea of getting bored seemed a little bit counterintuitive. Like, oh, aren't I supposed to be doing something to be more creative? But when we get bored, and what I was talking about earlier, which is getting in a space of solitude and peace, it allows your mind to just wander, similar to meditating. So, meditating could be a similar thing. But when your mind just wanders, you can even also give it a prompt. So, let's say you want to be creative for a specific reason, maybe creative problem solving, or maybe you're an artist. You can give yourself a prompt. If you're an artist, maybe it's, what are the possibilities that I can draw today? So, some sort of prompt, and then you just sit with it. Get bored, nothing around, no electronics, a little bit of, no music or anything, and let your mind wander. And eventually, you'll notice that your brain is just like coming up with ideas left and right. And some of them are outlandish, like you're never going to implement. But it's important to remember that when you are in that space and you are becoming bored, that we're not in a space of judgment. It's more of an observation. And if we can observe those things and then pick out the either ideas or things that come to mind that seem more practical to what we want, then we can follow it. And then we open up another space. Maybe it's another prompt, or maybe you just sort of sit and wait and continue to be bored. Then it opens up more ideas. And it's like following a little train of thoughts until maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's 2 minutes, maybe it's 20 minutes. It's up to you, really. But that is my go-to piece of advice for anybody who's looking to strengthen their creativity or struggling with creativity. Because I think that for somebody like me who's I would say naturally creative, it's easy for me to pare down and become more organized. But for anybody who's the opposite, whereas maybe a little bit more left-brained and is very organized, logical thinking, linear thinking, and needs to open, it's a little bit more difficult. So that boredom allows for that expansion, which is that creativity.
So, do you sit there with like a notepad or something to jot down your creative ideas, or if you're a painter, do you actually have the canvas there, or what's the process? Because you don't want to lose those ideas; you want to capture them. So,
Yeah, that's a great. I'm glad you mentioned that too. I think there's no wrong way to do it. Uh, I like to use a whiteboard. I have one right behind my computer over there, and sometimes I'll get bored and just sort of stare at it until I want to write something down. And if you said painting, same thing. I think that if you're trying to really come up with ideas, the process of boredom, yeah, maybe you want to have something to write down so that you don't forget. But I think even doing this as a practice every day, just for the heck of it, is also really good for creativity. It's like triggering your mind. Oh, hey, when I want to come up with ideas, it's not a constant struggle. There's not as much resistance because I've been practicing this idea of allowing ideas to flow and come up to the surface.
It reminds me of that scene in Mad Men when Don Draper's just sitting there like drinking a bourbon, and I think Sterling comes in and says, "I pay you a lot of money to look like you're sitting around doing nothing." But what he was doing as the character, was just giving himself that solitude to come up with the idea. Very
Exactly.
cool. Yeah. Okay, our final question. Why do the Yankees always win?
Oh man, dude, is this going to be like a pun joke, or is this
It's a
trick?
pun joke.
It is
Yeah.
a pun joke. Oh, okay, cool. I don't know.
Because they can't keep their eyes off the pinstripes.
Ooh,
Like
that's a
on
good one.
stripes. Yeah. So can you thank you so much for joining us on here. And can you please tell everybody where to find you?
Yes, absolutely. You can find me on all my socials at Haylee Kalani, spelled like that. And if you're interested in figuring out more, if this is something that you even are interested in, you can go to my website, which is hkalaniconsulting.com.
That's wonderful. Again, thank you for helping us to be more creative, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank
And
you.
I'll talk to you again soon. This has been The Jungle, Slike with Stripes with Haylee Kalani, and we'll talk to you again next Friday at 8. Bye.